Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to our ritual night talk for November 9th. I'm Scott Stenwick, your host for these ritual night events, presented under the auspices of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Before I get going, I got to do my good YouTuber spiel. So like, subscribe, request notifications. That way you won't miss anything when we're going live with these presentations. Had a little bit of a glitch here, so we're going live at 8:02 instead of 8 o'clock. So if you had your notifications, you would be updated with respect to that. So notifications are good. I have also included the donation link as usual. Donations help to support the operation of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis. So tonight I am going to talk about magic and skepticism. And I'm talking about two different kinds of skepticism. So first of all, there's the skeptical attitude that have, right? Okay, so you want to be skeptical about reality. You don't want to be credulous about things that are happening. You don't want to be, believing things that, are absolutely not true. That runs into the realm of conspiracy theories and all kinds of other stuff that works poorly with respect to critical thinking. Okay, so we want to be critical thinkers and we want to be skeptical in that sense. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. The kind of skeptic, though, that we don't want to be, okay, is the capital S skeptic, as in the skeptic movement, okay, that was very popular in the 1990s, got a lot of media attention, and basically is antithetical to anything that could possibly be considered paranormal, and not necessarily even from the standpoint of, oh, well, we're going to investigate it and find out, but oh, well, we know this isn't true, so anybody who's doing it or saying anything about it is perpetrating a fraud. Okay, that is not who we want to be, because frankly, that is not skeptical. That is closed-minded. And Robert Anton Wilson, he wrote a wonderful book about that movement called The New Inquisition. You should check that out if you're interested. Very fun read. Has, some great quotes in it. Like, for example, people ask me if I believe in unidentified flying objects. I do. And that's because that's because I come across many unidentified non-flying objects in the course of my daily life. Okay. So it's this kind of a thing but the capital S skeptics, well, you can't, none of this stuff is spiritual stuff. None of this works. I know magic doesn't work, but not even that. Back in the 90s, they were complaining about things like meditation and how meditation doesn't do anything. And now we have all the scientific evidence that supports that meditation works. There was an article that was published, years ago on Slate magazine, talking about how, oh, there's absolutely no scientific basis for acupuncture. And then about a month later, some researchers came out with something that, oh, that actually might be a plausible mechanism for acupuncture, which I talked about on the blog. And it's like, okay, so what does that say about this skeptic who's like, well, obviously it can't work? Well, let's say that these scientists discovered something. I'm not positive that they did. I haven't gone and followed up on all the studies, refutations, replications, and so on. It's possible they didn't. But let's say that they did. If they did discover something, and then there's some advantage to not having this closed-minded, oh, nothing like this can possibly work sort of attitude. And I really don't think that that's a good way to go through life. I don't think it's a good way to go through life thinking that, oh, everything works absolutely the way I think it does, and anything that doesn't work the way I think it does is obviously fraud. I don't know. That seems like a pretty hostile view of the world to me. And it's not really a world that I would want to live in. So I think there's some utility to not embracing that belief structure to begin with. Okay. At the same time, we're not supposed to be credulous either. If you look at something and okay, so it's a magical or a psychic thing, and somebody is talking about this or that they've done, you should be skeptical. And that includes me. Okay, if I say, well, I've done this and this and this, I could tell you that I'm not perpetrating a fraud. I definitely believe what I'm saying. But it is possible that when I have done some of these experiments with magic, there could have been biases or issues that crept into my research, which is part of the reason that I talk about this. And I want people to share results magically because some of the things that I found could be wrong. And, I don't have the kind of sample size, having a scientific background, knowing what I would need from the standpoint of statistical validity. So that's important to think about too. Now, I will say, though, that if you actually take off the capital S skeptic glasses, there is an awful lot of evidence that paranormal things at least can happen. Okay. And one of the things that I think is not a useful question at all to ask is that, well, how do you prove that magic is real? And I don't think that that's a helpful question. And the reason it's not a helpful question is because it's grounded in this Cartesian dualism that we have in our society. So, this idea that, oh, if something is imaginary, it's not real. Okay. So, think about the implications of that for a minute. I mean, I will grant, there are certainly some cases where, um, you know, I could say I'm imagining, a vase sitting over there on the table, and you look and there's nothing on the table. Well, clearly the vase is something that is existing in my imagination, or there's something going on that's preventing you from seeing the vase. Maybe it's a funny angle, maybe it's a mirror. Stage magicians use tricks like that all the time. But the point is that um, this idea that thoughts and imagination and things like that are not real is very much a philosophical choice. It doesn't really have anything to do with, something that is, metaphysically grounded in the universe. And, maybe that's a little surprising. I don't know, just people with a scientific background or something like that. Because what science does try to do is science tries to put forth a methodology that removes bias and removes, preconceptions about the research. They, of course, creep in anyway because, no process is perfect. But the scientific process is pretty much the best process we have for that. So one of the functions, one of the ways that science works is it tries to produce data without the preconceptions of the person conducting the experiment. But I do not think that means that any preconceptions a person might have about an experiment are not real. Okay. And let me also say that much of academic paranormal research in the United States has been focused on that question. Are psychic phenomena real? Okay. Well, and I would put forth that sort of research is not really being done in the correct vein. Okay, and here's what I mean by that. So, in the Soviet Union and the United States, especially during the Cold War, both had psychic research programs. Okay, and the academic parapsychology research was essentially saddled with this huge burden of, well, you have to prove that what you're studying is real before we can accept that any of your research might be valid. This was a problem that goes back to the 1930s. Joseph Banks Rhine at Duke University was one of the first parapsychology researchers. And there are some issues that have been identified with Rhine's methodology by modern researchers, but not all of it has been, completely discredited or anything like that. And furthermore, Rhine was not trying to promulgate some kind of a fraud. He was legitimately trying to explore this stuff with experimental methodologies that he had at his disposal. And so an article that I read that was from, I believe it was like the late 50s, early 60s, talking about Rhine after he'd been doing this work for decades. The comment was, well, Dr. Rhine has provided us with data that would, prove the validity of, basically any other subject. But because this is related to psychic abilities, I just don't like it. And that was literally the point of the argument. It's like, you just don't like it? Okay. One of the other things that has been leveled at parapsychology research is that a mechanism for paranormal action, like spirits, psychic abilities, and so on, hasn't really been identified in an experimental fashion. And I would argue that is much the same as the situation magic is in that consciousness has to be one of the key variables of any psychic ability, right? You're either, receiving information or you're projecting information, about the past, present, future, That pretty much sums up, most of what you got there. And then, you have things like telekinesis where, you're causing things to move and so forth. So that type of thing is like, well, if you can't, you could do a research program. You could sit there and say, all right, we found some cases where these things were better than chance. But since you can't measure what was actually going on in the person's consciousness when they did this, and back in Duke, certainly even, 20 or 30 years ago, it was hard to get a really good hit on, what the brain was. You had EEGs, but, the last 10, 15 years, we found that, EEGs for aggregate brainwaves aren't that useful. You need positioning sensors to check like certain areas with elevated firing, certain areas with lowered firing. And the whole issue is a lot more complicated than what was previously thought. And so because we don't have that piece, we can't sit there and say, oh, well, so if your consciousness or maybe your brain is doing this, and you should be able to do that. And then you could test a hypothesis and see if it's valid and so on. But we don't have this measuring instrument. The other problem is that most psychic phenomena are weak phenomena. And I've had people take me to task on this, saying that magic is a weak phenomenon in the sense that magic can be profoundly powerful. I mean, there's ways you could use it to transform your entire life, right? And that's, a lot more significant than, physics says, I can put my hand over here and like pick up this wand, right? It's a lot more significant to transform your whole reality. Okay. That's not what I mean by a weak effect. What I mean by a weak effect is it is not nearly as reliable as physical effects. I reach over, pick this up every single time I do this. If I drop it, it'll drop like that. It'll drop according to an equation. I can just say, oh, that equation tells me how fast it drops. I mean, all this kind of stuff that we can do in the physical sciences is possible because physical science measures strong phenomena, that is, reliable phenomena that work in a deterministic way. Okay. And furthermore, don't have variables in them that are, related to things like consciousness and these other kinds of factors. Okay. So those are strong phenomena. And you're going to find there is a little bit of variation in the laws of physics. And I mean, I wonder if, haven't done this experiment, but, if you had somebody who, really was able to, who claimed that, they could do some telekinetic effect or something, do an experiment where you drop something, hundreds of times or thousands of times and see if, this person focusing their mind a certain way could reliably make the thing fall faster or slower than it should. But the thing is, it's going to fall a little bit faster or a little bit slower than it should. And that little bit is what I'm talking about as weak phenomena. Now, as chaos magicians discovered, like from the late 70s, and then, published in texts like, Peter Carroll's Liber Chaos in the early 90s, many systems of nature have these properties that can be modeled using mathematics called chaos theory. And what that means is when you have a system that has all these critical points all over the place, and maybe even every single point is a critical point, you can do a small push at that system, and your change is going to propagate through the whole thing, and it's going to be magnified. And so it can turn into something much bigger. The canonical example is called the butterfly effect. The idea that, well, the air, it's possible that a butterfly could flap its wings in the air, and that perturbation in the air somehow, weeks down the road could cause a hurricane that might not otherwise happen. That is actually true if you study weather and atmospheric dynamics. So a magician, who is, say, a master of weak effects, can take a weak effect and point it in the right spot. And as long as it hits the right spot in the universe, it can propagate outward and can produce a much bigger effect. The problem, though, is that chaos theory is fundamentally non-deterministic and non-linear. It's very hard to model. And it's not, a simple thing like drop this and, it just, follows, the standard equations for, Earth's gravity. It's not something like that. And I think that if you go into magic with the idea that it's like that, which you see a little bit of this, like in horror movies and stuff, where it's like, well, okay, I found a book of magic and I opened the book of magic. I just like recite this thing from the book of magic and this like incredible, powerful thing happens. Magic is not like that. Okay. It's not a case where if you say these right words, it will automatically happen every time. It does not work that way. It's not Wingardium Leviosa, and then your feather floats up like in Harry Potter. That's not how it works. And it's not a matter of pronouncing the word exactly right to get a deterministic effect either. It's about how your mind is working with the space that you're in and what kinds of changes your mind can mobilize that can have an effect on initially small things in the material world, but can potentially propagate into much larger things. A fair number of people can do weather magic. Weather is actually a really good example of a system like the butterfly hurricane example that is governed by some of these chaos dynamics. And if you know where to push the weather, you can get an effect, but it does take time. So to amplify what you're doing, there's going to be an amount of time that goes into that. And, you don't necessarily know how long it's going to take at the outset. Now, all kinds of things you can do in your magical operations to deal with that. You could say, you want this change. This is the time limit you want. And then the probability shifts as much as it's going to shift. Okay. You can work with spirits. Spirits are helpful. Spirits are like consultants. They're like experts in what you're trying to do. So one of the advantages of working with like say, like an aerial spirit, if I'm trying to do weather magic, is that I could say, all right, so I want this to happen. And the spirit knows, okay, well, the spirit can push the weather. Your power goes into pushing the weather too, because both your power and the spirit's power work together for the most powerful magical operations. What the spirit has that you don't, though, is the spirit has the knowledge of where the push should go. And that's why working with spirits is more effective. Otherwise, it can be kind of a willy-nilly thing. I mean, you can kind of focus it the way you think it should be, look at weather maps. Okay, you kind of want it to be shaped like this or that. But working with a spirit is more effective because the spirit has specialized knowledge, because this is their sphere of influence. Most spirits are experts in their sphere of influence. But all right, so drifting into spirits, that's getting a little far afield. Drifting back to this idea of skepticism and magic. Every magician should do experiments. I am absolutely convinced that, like I talked about last week, the scientific illuminist model is the best way to explore this subject. There are things that the traditions teach us, and we absolutely should look at traditional information, but we also should try that information out. Um, Magic is what I more positively than the capital S skeptic would call a proto-science. Okay. And skeptics like to use pseudoscience because they want to imply fraud. And I don't think that's what we're talking about here. Although, I mean, there are people who are fraudulent about magical powers they claim they have. Somebody who claims that they can do psychic power, psychic abilities, psychic effects, paranormal effects, with their psychic powers, and they could do it in a completely reliable, completely deterministic way, probably is a fraud, or at least is a fraud some of the time. They might have some real abilities, but a lot of the time, but to make magic and psychic effects completely reliable, you have to fake some of the time. Okay. Famous example of this is a Uri Geller who was outed by the capital S skeptics. And the fact was, some of the stuff Uri Geller was doing was stuff that should be outed. Basically, he was going around doing this thing where he could telekinetically bend spoons, supposedly, and that's a simple stage magic trick. I mean, I can do it myself, and there's a lot of different ways to do it, and it doesn't involve magic or anything. Or you're holding the spoon at the right angle, or you bend it ahead of time to weaken the metal. There's all kinds of different methods, and I mean, you read a book on stage magic, you're going to find that. So I think that it was fraudulent for him to claim, well, this is a manifestation of psychic powers. However, Geller did also do some university research on more psychic-like stuff. And, some of the methodologies were flawed, and some of the skeptics were able to come into labs and show that they could do some of the same things with trickery. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the dude isn't psychic. He might be. I don't actually know. I do know that he is consulted by large corporations and so on, and that is still going on. And they haven't dumped him yet, as in they must be getting something for their money. So perhaps he does have some ability there, and he may have strong psychic abilities. It's just that particular thing with the spoons, that was a trick. And just about any psychic, if they want to say, oh, this is like completely reliable, they have to resort to trickery. Similarly, somebody says, oh, my magic always works. Well, you know what? It doesn't. I could tell you for a fact, magic doesn't always work. In fact, if it did always work, I would be a regular academic scientist, running normal experiments on magic. If it was that reliable, it would be so easy to demonstrate that it wouldn't even be a question over, oh, does it exist? Okay. And so even though that's the wrong, it would be super easily answerable if we were talking about strong phenomena. But we're not. We're talking about weak phenomena, which are fundamental, at least somewhat unreliable and non-deterministic. And so getting back to my point on the psychic research program. So in America, academics, parapsychology had this whole burden of trying to show that psychic abilities were real. Okay. Not here's how they work. Are they real? Okay. And the fact is that that's an enormous burden to put on anybody doing scientific research. Hey, is the thing you're studying real? In the Soviet Union, it was done completely differently. And in the Soviet psychic research program, what they looked at was what I think is a better question. And, not that it's a political point at all. It's just this is kind of how the sides tended to diverge during the Cold War, is that in the Soviet program, they looked at, all right, so people are reporting these things. Let's find out what they are. Not do they exist, what they are. Okay. And one possible explanation is of what it could be is it could be fraud. That's completely valid because there were some people who were not necessarily outed as fraudulent during the Soviet research program. But their work, I did see a documentary where they went back and like talked to some of the people who had been thought of as being psychics. Like one of the guys, he's like showing, oh, I can levitate this thing. And then they're like, oh, hey, what's that? And, he has like a monofilament wire, because, okay, so he's obviously faking, right? And, probably that particular person was faking back when he was doing stuff for the psychic research program too. But so fraud is one possibility, but it's a lot better, I think, to look at the world in terms of, all right, here's what's being reported, what's going on, as opposed to people are reporting this thing and I just think they're full of it, which is kind of the capital S skeptic thing. Okay. And let me also add that American skeptics do have their own version of paranormal, which is called mass hysteria. Okay, if you get skeptics talking about anything, it's like a weird phenomenon and it's experienced by multiple people. There's, oh, well, it's mass hysteria. Okay, mass hysteria might as well be paranormal. Nobody really understands how it works. Nobody really completely even gets what it is. It has been applied to things that very obviously aren't mass hysteria and so forth. I mean, one of the most recent ones where that happened was it had to do with that illness that some of the diplomats in Cuba were having. Like they were having trouble with confusion and stuff like this. And people said, "Oh, it's like some kind of a sonic weapon." Well, it didn't turn out to be that. Some people thought it was mold. It didn't turn out to be that. Whole time, the skeptics go, "Oh, it's mass hysteria." And these are people who have like concussion level brain injuries, right? Oh, but it's mass hysteria. It's like, come on. They are as free with that as we are with, oh, it's a spirit. And really should be treated with about the same level of, credulousness. That is, I think not very much at that point. And let me be clear on that too. If somebody says, oh, this is a spirit doing that, you should always be skeptical of that. So no, I'm saying don't be credulous about my spirit. Don't be credulous about my spirit claims either. If I say, well, I had a spirit do this and this and this, like, all right, well, what was your procedure? All right, I'll publish my procedure. Here it is. Try it, and then you see what happens, right? This is peer review, this back and forth. This is magic working like the physical sciences, which is really what we should be aspiring to. Okay, but So don't be credulous about mass hysteria. Don't be credulous about paranormal effects. Paranormal effects are called paranormal because they are unusual. They're things that are, at least considered outside the regular experience of people. I do happen to think that spirits and spiritual forces are around us all the time. I've experienced them on many occasions. I think that some of the misconceptions about magic, like the idea that, oh, you attract larvae or like spiritual forces when you start doing magic. That was like an old belief that was put out in the early 20th century. I don't think that's true at all. I think what's going on is you do magic and you develop your psychic senses, and then you start perceiving this stuff that was around you the whole time. And so you're like, oh, where did these come from? Well, you improved your senses. It's not that they were actually attracted. If anything, spirits tend to avoid magic in my experience. I've always been like, hey, I want to have a haunted house so like I can have a ghost and like, see if I could talk it into, anchoring its talisman and then like doing stuff for me, right? I would love that, especially like a poltergeist, right? That could move things. Like, I could have it like bring me drinks from the kitchen. That's fantastic, right? And I wouldn't be, I don't work coercively with spirits. It'd be the kind of thing, if there's something the spirit wants, some form of payment that they want for doing that, I'm totally down with it. But come on, that's awesome. You have your magic friends over, you're sitting in the living room, you like say an incantation and say, okay, bring me a drink. And it like floats in from the kitchen. That would be awesome. Okay, I think that that's probably beyond the bounds of possibility, but pretty awesome. And so, but I've owned old houses. I've gone to old houses. I've walked through houses that are supposedly haunted. If I do magic in a space like that, everything quiets down. It's like the spirits, they like run away or something. And so I don't know what that's about, but if you're doing magic in a space, it's pretty unlikely to be haunted, I think, unless you maybe specifically go to the trouble of inviting particular spirits, in, maybe building, anchors or spirit houses for them and stuff like that, which is a program that I have not undergone at any of my properties. But maybe that's what it takes. It's certainly not something where doing magic attracts stuff to you that, is not the kind of thing you're working for. I mean, the lesser ritual, the pentagram, lesser ritual, the hexagram are basically like creating magic circles. And in magic circles, they generally, keep things out as opposed to pulling things in. It's a containment structure that you use to pull things in. But anyway, so the thing about that is, though, is that you should experiment and you should, if possible, experiment and try to get hard numbers. Because one of the problems with trying to work something as subjective as magic is your spell can feel amazing when you do it. But did you get what you charged for? Did you get what you wanted? Was your will accomplished? Because if it wasn't, your magical operation could feel like the most amazing thing in the world, but it didn't accomplish what you wanted. Likewise, if you are doing a mystical operation directed at, some sort of ecstatic change in consciousness, and that felt wonderful, okay, cool. That's what you were going for. It doesn't always have to be a physical thing. It's just physical things are easier because they're definitive. Okay, you cast a spell for $100. Do you get $100? Okay, well, maybe you do, in which case it's a success. Maybe you get $60 that came from some source that you didn't see, in which case that's a partial success. Or maybe you don't see any change and that's a failure. Okay, and you want to log your spells like that as best you can based on the results you get. Now, there are many reasons that a spell could fail. And sometimes it's a case where it's some kind of procedural issue. Often it's not, though. Magical procedure is not really that complicated. It doesn't hinge on things like, Leviosa, exact, precise pronunciations of words. It really more hinges on what your mind is doing. I mean, kind of like, the Eastern meditation systems do, except in the Western magical system, that's externalized. But the work with the mind is still fundamental and foundational. If you don't have a lot of ability to work with your mind, you're probably not going to be a very good magician. And the way to learn to work with your mind is to meditate. Most systems of meditation are about as effective. So, I mean, you could just go ahead and do something basic, like, mindfulness meditation, which is, you sit quietly and you just, follow your breath and you pay attention to your thoughts for a period of time, and don't worry about your mind wandering. Don't try to just, oh, it wandered, just bring it back to the breath. And it's just this light thing. You don't want to like be having recriminations for yourself. How dare my mind wandered? You don't want that, because you don't want to bring up that kind of an emotion in the context of your meditation. You just want to be, notice how it wandered, it wandered, it wandered. And what's going to happen is that over time, it's going to start wandering less. And then eventually you get to a point where you can just kind of observe thoughts and let them go. But this isn't something that you force yourself to do. And that can be hard actually reading Crowley, because there's some stuff in Crowley where he talks about meditation like it's this thing that you're going to force your mind to do this or this or this, when really it's a matter of what you're forcing yourself to do is stick with the practice diligently. And over time, that faculty will just naturally arise. It's not, there is a problem with trying too hard. You want to have, kind of a light touch on the universe. The idea of, the Tao being the path of least resistance, within the constraints you impose upon what you're doing. That is a good concept and is, not just limited to Taoism. It's a principle that seems to apply across, many esoteric disciplines. So always experiment, always test stuff out, see what happens. When I was a young beginning magician and the skeptics were getting all kinds of airtime, early 90s, right? I hadn't been doing magic that long, okay, at that point. And the thing is that, you get this idea in your head, yeah, I'm gonna prove those people wrong. And it's like, but you get older and you're like, what's the point of that? There is definitely a point to researching and trying to determine the parameters of magic and what it can do. That's important to understand. If you want to look at a situation, you're like, okay, do I use magic here or don't I? Well, the answer is usually yes, because magic is going to increase the odds in whatever you do. But magic is never a substitute for mundane action. So like you do a spell to get a job. Okay, well, you gotta contact people, you gotta send out resumes, you gotta do all the stuff that you would otherwise need to do to get a job. The point is that magic makes it better and it makes it work faster. What you get is going to be more in harmony with your will and is going to, probably pay more, probably have more benefits than you would otherwise get just following the mundane practice without magic. But that is how it works. It's like magic is largely something that you use to augment characteristics in your life. It's not something that usually can just, create a situation completely out of nothing. And the reasoning behind that is because the probability shifts that magic do have some limitations. If they didn't, a bunch of wizards would have won the Powerball by now. I mean, come on, I've tried. Tons of magicians have tried. It's like the vast majority of people who I see who are Powerball winners or whatever, they're not spiritual practitioners. I don't know that I've ever seen a magician win it. There was one story, I think 10 years ago, about somebody who was Wiccan and they won like $1 million in a lottery or something like that. But again, they hadn't necessarily done a particular spell. They just, bought a ticket. And it's like, well, okay, so devotional work, can sometimes increase your luck overall. And maybe that's what it was. But the thing is, it's like, so that one person out of how many people have tried, if magic didn't have probability limits, okay, well, I could throw 100 million to one shift like that. And well, I'd be a Powerball millionaire and that would be that, right? I would just have all the money to do what I wanted to do. So there is a limit and we're not necessarily sure where the limit falls. And one of the things that I think would be useful to do research on magic is to look at, what the probability shifts are that can be created. I definitely have done enough work, and I had gotten to a point where I'd done enough work, 20 years ago, that I was sure magic had an effect. Okay, I could do, control groups versus groups with spells. And I did a bunch of tests on lottery numbers, didn't win the Powerball, but I could show that, I would get, more numbers out of the 6 if I did a spell, and that was pretty reliable. And so, things like that I have done. And you get to a point where, why do you necessarily need to prove it to anybody, especially somebody who is like predisposed to shut down everything you're about? And yeah, I'm not even going to go into some of the stuff with the Randy challenge, but look that up sometime. Like, oh, no one ever passed the preliminary test. Okay. Your preliminary test was calibrated with about 1,000 to 1 probability shift. Okay. So here's what you showed. You showed that the limit of magic, at least limit of paranormal psychic effects of, the people you selected, okay, a somewhat random sampling, people who were committed enough to actually do it, okay. What you showed was that the probability shift that can be accomplished is probably below 1,000 to 1. That's what you showed. Okay, so if the limit is below 1,000 to 1, all of a sudden, hey, nobody passed the preliminary test. Well, that doesn't make it 0. There were a lot of people who came close to passing those preliminary tests, but didn't reach the threshold of 1,000 to 1 against, but definitely performed substantially better than chance. My research suggests that the biggest probability shifts I can do are probably somewhere around 200 or 300 to 1 against, and that's like with all the other casting stuff being perfect. It's all right. Well, if I could throw, a 300 to 1 against, it's like, well, I wouldn't pass the challenge either. But what could you do in your life if on a daily basis you are throwing 300 to 1 probability shifts? I mean, if you think about that from the standpoint of working magic over time, the improvements that you can create in your life, it's a really big deal. And it's totally worth getting good at. It's like, 100 to 1 against is, I play Dungeons and Dragons, percentile die. 100 to 1 against is, you roll a 0-0 every time. That's pretty unlikely. And if you can make stuff that unlikely happen in your life fairly reliably, you're going to be able to navigate your life in a good direction. And I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that magic at that level is a thing that exists. And furthermore, not just from the standpoint of my metaphysics. So my metaphysical idea is more like anything that can be experienced exists. The question is, okay, does it exist, in the microcosm? Does it exist in the macrocosm? Or does it exist in both? And I think that using that magical structure of microcosm, macrocosm, and the universe being the union of microcosm and macrocosm, so the totality of all those things is what exists, then it suggests that a far better method for working with magic is to say, all right, people are reporting that these things happen. What are they? And if I get. So as with most of the, as I've said in many of these videos, it's about sitting down, doing the work, and seeing what happens. Maybe you find you have no talent for magic whatsoever. Everybody does not have an equal level of magical talent, much as New Agers might like to claim that. It's kind of like the idea of, well, it's magical, so it's supernatural, so it doesn't have natural limits. But I actually don't believe in the supernatural. And that does not mean that I only believe in psychological stuff. I believe very strongly in the paranormal. But I believe that essentially nature exists. Nature is the totality of everything that exists, both microcosm and macrocosm. And as a result, it's kind of silly to say that I'm thinking of this thing, but it doesn't exist. I could say, I'm thinking of this thing and it exists in my imagination, but it doesn't exist over there on the table, which is entirely valid. But understanding the idea of how these different realms work in magic is, not only it's a key component of understanding the tradition, but I think it has a lot to do with how all the stuff works and how we're, someday going to figure out, how to do this in a more reliable, controllable fashion through, good old-fashioned scientific research applied to these problems. So I'm starting to get a little bit long here, coming up on 40 minutes. And I just want to point out, I'm going to tell one other story. I had one person approach me wanting to learn magic many, many years ago. Okay. And this person seemed to be interested. They had all these questions, but they wouldn't actually practice anything. Okay. And so the reason they gave for it was well, if you can't guarantee to me that if I do these practices, I'll definitely be able to do these incredible things, it's not worth my time. Okay. And that was a very, very frustrating set of interactions. I didn't know what to say to a person like that. It's like, you can't guarantee magical results of X type for practice Y. It doesn't really work that way. But if you do practice Y for an extended period of time, you will tend to get results similar to an approximating X if you stick with it. Okay, and so that's totally different than how the physical sciences work with strong phenomena. It's like, if you can't promise me that, this one will fall at the rate I'm expecting, I won't pick it up. It's like, well, there it goes. I mean, so that's the kind of thing that's too that I think really gets in the way for people. It would have been far more reasonable for this individual to, okay, start doing some magical practices, keeping your magical journal, which is really important. Your magical journal is your lab notes. Like I said last week, scientific illuminism. If we're going to do this, you write it down. You don't rely on memory, because what's going to happen is you get selection bias in your memory. You put it in the journal. Every result, every success, every failure. And then you can analyze it like a scientist would analyze experimental data. But it would be far more reasonable for somebody to do the practices, for a period of time, and then, see what they think. It's like, I'm not getting anything out of this. Okay, well, you tried it. Cool. Maybe it's not for you. On the other hand, maybe you try it and what you experience is like completely not what you expect at all. And it's this thing that is far more profound and far more wonderful and far more meaningful. And I know that, the thing that makes me stick with magic, for me, magic is profound, it's wonderful, and it's meaningful. And that's the thing. It's like, even experiences I had early on before I did, the scientific testing and all this kind of stuff, convinced me that this was absolutely important. And it was something that, I was never going to drop as long as I lived, because it really was that profound. And starting to find out, hey, I can measure the probabilities, I can get some results from that. That's even better still. I am not an adherent at all of the psychological only model of magic. I think a dash only model of magic, no matter what it is probably wrong, because magic is a more holistic phenomenon than that. But I will say that, even if magic was just a souped up way of working with my own psychology, the fact is, I would still find it profound. I would still find it meaningful. I would still find it worth doing. And really, the fact that it isn't, as far as I can tell anyway, facts that I can, determine with the experimental apparatus with which I'm limited and so forth, that's just a bonus. That just makes it better. So with that, I'm going to sign off for the night. See, I've got the donation link there. Donations support the operations of Leaping Laughter Lodge in Minneapolis, Minnesota. No donation is too small. Request notifications, subscribe to the channel so you can see when we go live here on the Leaping Laughter YouTube channel. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for watching and have a great rest of the evening. Love is the law. Love under will.